In the reading of the Gospels, it's rare to have a story appear in all four, let alone appear 6 times. We have the feeding of the multitude happen twice in both Matthew and Mark. But what's unique about the Gospel of John's account is that he ties it to the Passover. No other feeding of the multitudes is tied to the Passover. And we also see connections to the Old Testament, not just with Passover, but we see with the feeding of barley loaves a connection to Elisha. And Elisha had a story very similar where there was a large crowd and he said, "How are we to feed all these people?" And he had 20 barley loaves, fed folks, and had extra. And we also see a connection to the great Moses. He fed the wandering Israelites out of Egypt, which is the celebration of freedom. And as they wandered, we may remember that they started to grumble because they were hungry, understandably so. And so God did this miraculous thing and provided manna from heaven. And so they were fed to their fill, much like we see those on a hillside with Jesus. And so we see in the Gospel of John him connecting Jesus to the prophets of age. So often we try to set Jesus apart from those prophets, and yet we are told he was there to fulfill the law and all of the teachings. And John ties him so beautifully to these spaces. But the difference in the Gospel of John is that he goes further. Because Jesus wasn't just any old prophet, now was he? We see that when he feeds the multitudes, there are 12 baskets left over. Some say this is the fulfillment and completion of the 12 tribes of Israel. We also see, unlike with Moses, that when there was leftover manna, it would perish or go bad if anyone tried to keep it. But we see with the 12 baskets of leftovers in the feeding of the multitude that it was really those on the outskirts who were then fed, meaning everybody had their fill and everybody was welcome. And then shortly after our text, in verse 20 of chapter 6 in the Gospel of John, we see that the disciples are on the waters in a boat. And they see this figure off in the distance coming towards them. And they become terrified. Previous readings of this for me meant that, well, yeah, there's a guy walking on water. Of course they would be freaked out. And yet, in rereading, I realized they were terrified because they realized it was God walking on water. It was God whom they had been following, and it was God who had just performed all the miracles. It was not a prophet enabled by God, but God in human form. I don't know about you, but I'd be terrified. Plus, there was a guy walking on water. None of it would be soothing. But could you imagine? In that moment, you saw him feed 5,000. And as my Tuesday morning Bible study will remind me, numbers aren't real in the Bible. I know whether there were 5,000 or not, that is a moot point. What it means is there was a great deal of folks, and a miracle happened. And we see this miraculous story play out. Jesus is the one to initiate the issue. Technically, there wasn't a problem because the crowd approaching them didn't have an expectation to be fed, and the disciples didn't have a registration of who they would feed so that they knew how many loaves and fishes to have. So technically, they could have gone along their way, and everybody would have been fine. But Jesus creates the conundrum. And he turns to poor Philip, who probably was the closest in proximity and regretting the way he chose to stand next to Jesus. Because he turns to Philip and goes, "Philip, where are we going to get all the food for these folks?" And Philip's like, "I don't know. I didn't ask them to come. I am tired." Can we just eat? Like, is that an option here? And Jesus is like, no. We feed them. They have followed us. We shall feed them. And then Andrew, who is Simon Peter's brother. Remember, Peter's always the one like, I have the answer. And Andrew comes up and he's like, I have the answer. He's like, there's this child with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And then he realizes what he said, and he was like, but I don't, okay, never mind. That's not going to feed everybody, so I'm just going to step on back and pretend like I didn't say anything. Plus, we're taking a little kid's lunch. It all now sounds like a terrible plan. But Jesus, being one who never looked at a situation at face value, said, go and get those 2 fishes and 5 loaves. Go to the child. The rest of you organize everybody and sit them down. And they're all probably like, oh man, our job today is not what I thought. You sit here, please make space, right? And as they're doing this, Jesus takes the food. Much like we do at this very table, he lifts it to the heavens and he blesses it, and then he distributes it. And what I love about this is it's not that they just got a bite, right? They got their fill. They were happy and reclining on that large expansion of grass on earth as it is in heaven. We see this mundane act of bread and fish turned into a holy feast. And in it, we see who Jesus is. We may not understand how everybody got their fill, but we understand a bit more about this Christ that they were following. They were following because they saw people be healed in the towns before. They were wandering. Perhaps they too needed to be healed. Or perhaps they were just trying to understand who this rabbi really was. And in this space, we're told it was large expansions of grass on this hillside, reclining even. They realize this Christ is one who cares for their basic needs. Not one who sends them away and says, go find your own, but says, come and I will feed you. I will give you a banquet of pleasure. And then there were 12 left over. And I love this because it means that those who likely started to gather around, you know how viral videos start, like one person's watching and then 2 people come around and then there's this big crowd trying to figure out what's happening. If you feeding 5,000 people on a hillside, you don't think Wanderer's gonna come up and be like, what's going on? Oh, you're being fed, can I get some too? And Jesus doesn't say, no, this is for the in crowd. This is for those who already had tickets to the show. Oh, no. Because we serve a God of radical hospitality. So he said, let us make more. And he looks at the rational, very practical responses of Philip and of Andrew. And says, those roadblocks don't get to gospel imagination, but I will teach you how. And so he does. And then what I love is that he knows that he's about to be captured and handed over, and he needs to rest. And so he goes and he rests. Because the reality is, when we're in solidarity with each other, we also have to know when to tap out and take care of ourselves so that we can come back for the journey the next day. So he provided food for those who were hungry. He sought rest for himself who was weary. And the story continues on. I often wonder how we think of these stories. Are they just that, stories we tell? Or are they miracles that transform our lives? Do we really believe the teachings of Jesus? Of that radical hospitality that says, even if you weren't at the first sitting, I got you. Oftentimes, I wish Jesus had a prescription plan. I mean, there's a lot of books in Scripture, and I really wish there was like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many steps to do it right. Or I wish that there was a way for me to be on a boat with those disciples, seeing the very God that had created me walking towards me so that I could believe for sure, so that I could be terrified in awe. So often I think that I have made the gospel watered down. I have left them in the pages of Scripture. I bring them out for work, for personal exploration. But I don't know how often I let them transform me. I'm one who lives by experience, by and large. And if I've never seen a feeding of a multitude, then how am I going to believe there was a feeding of the multitude with Christ? And yet, that's where I stand with Philip and with Andrew, reminding Jesus, we only got 2 fish and 5 loaves. We don't want to cause more harm by telling people we're going to feed them and then not. So let us just go on our way. And that's when Jesus reminds me that gospel imagination is never about what's presented before you. It's about what God can do through you. But if we always wait until we have it all together, we can be waiting a long time. Because no matter how together you think you got it, you ain't ever at Jesus' level. And so with that, we get to a place of realizing we don't have to have all the courage. We don't have to have all the resources or all the right answers. What we get to have is faith. And let me tell you, that's harder than having all the resources, because we don't know how it's going to end. We may look foolish. We may not have it right. But shoot, if those disciples can follow Jesus, and let's face it, they didn't get it right all too often, I can follow Jesus and pray that God gets it right more than I get it wrong. So my question for us today is, how often do we say we only have 2 fish and 5 loaves? There's no way. Or how often do we say we got 2 fish, 5 loaves, party? I know I don't say the latter as much as I say the former. And that's because I have not fully learned how to lean into gospel imagination. I am a rational, contextual human being that likes a plan. And working with youth teaches me that often is not the plan we're going to have. And yet, I still say, well, clearly we can't act just yet because we don't have all the answers or all the resources. And Jesus turns to me and says, oh, child, you didn't hear my teachings. I've given you what I have given you. You can change the world. And I pray I believe it. Because this world needs some healing. This world needs some liberation. This world needs some transformation. And more than anything, it needs the good news. And if we ain't preaching it, if we ain't living it, then we have forgotten what we are called to do. So let us, not just as a community, but as individuals, turn to the needs of those around us and say, I got you. And not the simple kind that lets us pat ourselves on the back, but puts our bodies on the line, our resources on the line, our reputations at risk. Because if we can learn anything from Jesus, he was not a man of keeping calm reputations. He loved extravagantly. He welcomed all. And he always said, even when there was a big party of 5,000 or a welcoming of a prodigal son, he said, who's outside? Who needs to come on in? Who needs to be at this feast? And what did he do? He went to them and brought the party to them. The party of the good news. The good news that set them free. The good news that met them after their doubts on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Jesus, even though he put, according to John, Philip to the test and the others, disciples, he didn't scold them when they got it wrong. What he did was show them the way. So if we're in spaces of scolding folks, may we flip that around and say, may I journey with you? May we do this together. Because we serve a God of radical hospitality. One who says, you can have your lunch and we'll eat it too. The truth is, the table has been made ready. The question is, are we? Each of us has to answer it for ourselves, and we as a community have to answer it together. Sometimes it'll be a yes, thanks be to God. And other times it'll be a no. And thanks be to God that Jesus journeys with us, teaching us along the way. Because we ain't never got to have it all together. But when we got a little picnic lunch, let us have a holy feast. Amen.